So without further ado, let's welcome Eric Johnson, who is going to do a quick 10-minute keynote before we go to the Q&A. Eric Johnson, the floor is yours.
Hi, Quang, and thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk to this group. So I did prepare some short slides. So let's bring those up on the screen, and we can get started. So to start, a quick note about me, as Quang mentioned, I have a college degree in philosophy. It's a little bit unusual. I started my education electrical engineering. This is now over 20 years ago. I always programmed on the side as a hobby. It is interesting to me, though, that liberal arts degrees are somewhat overrepresented in engineering leadership. And there seems to be something, in particular with philosophy, around systems thinking and communication that seems to be valuable and allows us to bridge certain gaps. So as we get to the Q&A, there may be many of you in this group that come from a similar background, are earlier in their career, and have questions about things like, how do I navigate technical credibility? Happy to answer questions and things about that. In terms of, I won't read you my LinkedIn, but here's a slide with some stats about my most recent tenure. The other thing I'd highlight is some projects we did over that time frame where we did a lift and shift from Azure to GCP. Those are interesting projects. We added security as a third pillar to GitLab. We were the DevOps platform, then we became the DevSecOps platform. We sharded the GitLab.com database, and we launched a single tenant SaaS, a third delivery mode for the product, and lots more. We're also a Plato customer for over 3 years. It's still a Plato customer, but I was a Plato customer for a little over 3 years and really appreciated the elasticity of their mentorship resources. And while we had lots of internal mentorship programs, we valued the outside perspective you get from a platform like Plato, and they make it very easy to get that. So I still recommend Plato to lots of engineering leaders. In terms of what am I doing now, lots of family time, so lots of school pickup, drop off. Here's my 3 little girls in the back of our car on the way to school. Also doing some part-time advising, so helping engineering leaders scale and deal with people, process, and technology problems. So what is a counterintuitive solution? I don't want to take anything for granted here. So what are we talking about today? For me, these are the most fun and surprising types of learning. It's an example where probably my instinct has failed, and then I learned something that was the opposite that turned out to work. So that's another important point, is that where your mind jumps first is probably wrong for these types of issues. And the solution that actually works feels wrong in the beginning, but ends up working out in the end. These are also mistakes. Maybe you make them once, you probably never make them again because they tend to be poignant learning experiences, but you'll see these repeated at other organizations all the time. And so you want to think about, like, how am I in a position to help this other person, maybe one of your reports with one of these challenges. These also tend to be the stories, you're at a cocktail party, someone asks you about your career, you're thinking of that pithy anecdote. These tend to be the types of things that come up and people find somewhat interesting. And today we're going to talk about counterintuitive solutions to transparency, predictability, culture change, and how to communicate effectively. So I've got examples for each of those. So first is encouraging transparency. This is important because it builds a lot of trust, particularly with employees, particularly in a remote environment. And it's also really important for efficiency. The more transparent you are as a leader, the less you have to run those ACLs in your head of, I'm talking to so-and-so, what are they allowed to know about this topic at this point in time? It's sort of exhausting. And so the more transparency you can have, the more freely you can speak with information, and you'll find there's a lot lower mental overhead as a leader to running a transparent org. So in terms of don'ts and do's, I think what a lot of people jump towards is like, well, let's discourage secret keeping. That's probably where lack of transparency comes from. The problem with that is that secret keeping is not usually the root cause, and discouragement is not actually how people learn. The other thing people tend to do is like, well, let's make some pronouncements. Let's say in the engineering all hands meeting. You'll probably fail to create a more transparent environment, and then those pronouncements will ring hollow and ultimately negatively impact the credibility of leadership from doing so, because you're not delivering on those promises that you made. So in terms of like how you do create a more transparent environment, One example is you want to be very tolerant of mistakes. So risk aversion, as opposed to secret keeping, is why transparency usually recedes at organizations. In other words, like what could happen if some piece of information is leaked becomes a reason for everything to become non-transparent. So treat occasional breaches on the upper bound of transparency, not necessarily as a good thing, but as a reminder that like, hey, we're at the limit of transparency. Otherwise, you don't really know where that limit is. Another technique is try to make transparency the default as opposed to the exception. So examples are, see if you can work with your IT org and your leadership to make every Google Doc at your company editable by anyone by default. Sounds a little bit extreme, but I can say in 5 years, I never saw a single instance of someone editing something they shouldn't, or vandalizing a doc, or trying to cover up, something that they wrote earlier or something like that. It just doesn't happen in practice. Also, try to document a list of reasons about why something could not be seen by everyone. An example would be like if there's an active lawsuit that executives are discussing, and try to be transparent about non-transparency. Name internal documents, confidential, ... And if someone asks, why can't I see this? Say, well, it's on these list of reasons. I can't tell you why. If you're in the UK, I believe there's this notion of an injunction and a super injunction. An injunction is something the government says the press can't talk about. A super injunction is something where they say the press can't even say that there's a thing that they can't talk about, which is sort of silly. So I think it's that concept of allow for injunctions, but stay away from the sort of super injunction metaphor. And those two things have been quite effective for my time at GitLab, driving a transparent culture. So the next one is how to improve predictability. This is really important for expectation settings. For some companies, you can even get into revenue recognition problems, which can be quite difficult to deal with. So it's probably a big topic for engineering leaders, particularly from your product peers. Something that is really common to do is measure some form of a say-do ratio. How many story points did we commit to versus how many did we deliver at the end of the sprint? What happens is you accidentally incentivize sandbagging. People are people. Understandably, they'll only start to commit to exactly what they know they can deliver, and you lose a lot of ambition and velocity. So do's for improving predictability. One is demo your software. So I think this is sort of a forgotten tenet of Agile, particularly in a remote environment. But you really get the truest sense of status from seeing working software. It also helps you discover unknown unknowns. You don't learn at the end of the sprint or the day something is supposed to be deployed that is essentially broken. You learn earlier in a controlled way, and then you can make adjustments to the scope or to what you're building. Another way to improve predictability is to focus on work breakdown. So ship smaller units of value. You'll ship more, and you'll earn the trust of stakeholders by creating that culture of shipping. A lot of people ask, well, can't this just be gamed? Am I improving productivity? Am I improving predictability by just breaking things down smaller? And the answer is like, well, it can be, but it's anti-fragile in a way. If you're shipping smaller units of value, that's a proven way to manage complexity. Also, there's a lower bound of like, what if people start breaking things down to game a metric and makes them too small? That would be like the lower bound. Typically, you get pushback from code reviews, so you don't have to worry about people breaking things down into silly, small pieces. Other engineers will say like, hey, look, this should have been one thing. Let's make it one thing and ship it. So these two things have worked quite well. Another is culture change. This is something that's talked a lot about amongst engineering leaders. I don't think I need to talk about why this happens, but examples of culture changes are maybe you need to increase psychological safety. Maybe you want to raise accountability. Maybe you want to increase customer focus. That's quite an important one. Maybe engineering has become a little bit too focused on their tools or their architecture, or how they want to build things, and are losing sight of business value. But this could apply to any culture change in general. So the key here is that addressing culture head on is usually a mistake. Talking about culture to me is usually a mistake. Culture is sort of an emergent phenomenon. But to address it effectively, you kind of have to go upstream. There are root causes that you need to change instead. So things that do work for affecting culture change. One is leaders have to model the behaviors that they want to see. That's the main way people learn. They learn through observation. The next most efficacious way of learning is through positive incentives. And then the third is negative incentives or punishments. And that's a third, but a distant third. I'd say don't even try those sorts of things. But lots of people tend to focus on positive incentives and miss the opportunity to say, hey, I'm going to really show people through doing that this is what we value. And then people look at that and say like, okay, yeah, this is what's valued at the organization. This is how I might get promoted or recognized for these behaviors. The other one is aligning incentives. So make sure you're measuring the right things. Make sure that this is clear in the promotion and career development materials. Reinforce those behaviors that you want to see and align it with people's individual incentives. And then, another way to go upstream is like, who are you hiring? When you have the opportunity to grow your org, who you're adding, their own career experience, their distinctiveness, bringing that into your org is the surest way to change your culture. It's also, I think, the one that has the longest time frame, but don't miss that opportunity to really insert change into your hiring process. And then communicating efficiently. So why is this important? It's how you keep your team aligned. It's also how you create motivation. I'm a big fan of the Dan Pink book, Drive, Mastery, Autonomy, and Purpose. They're kind of the three things he talks about for motivating knowledge workers. How you communicate the story of what the company is achieving, where the product is going. That's a key way to impart purpose to engineers. And there can be a lot of Brownian motion. If you're not communicating consistently, you'll find people with their own ideas in their head kind of migrating off in different directions, far apart from one another. And so that's really important as well to maintain that alignment. So it doesn't work for communication. One is the idea, it's one and done. I sent an email, communication box checked. That never works. Another thing I've seen and actually done, and I still cringe about this, but like sending out a form or something like that, asking people to tick a box that they've received some piece of information or something like that, just it's not effective. It's not the way people learn. And you certainly can't say you've shipped some culture change or some other thing you're trying to communicate by doing so. And it usually erodes the credibility of management because it feels sort of icky in a way. What does work, and this is counterintuitive when you think about efficiency, is repetition. A lot of leaders, especially engineering leaders, sort of miss the opportunity to repeat themselves because it feels inefficient. I've already said this. Don't I sound silly saying this again? And what I've learned throughout my career and been told by other mentors and engineering leaders I've worked with is if you don't feel a little bit silly with how often you're repeating yourself, you're probably not doing it enough. Another thing that works is being multimodal. And again, this feels inefficient. Say the same thing over Slack, over email, in one-on-ones, in the all hands meeting, do weekly office hours. And even then, you're probably likely to get 80% of people. That's probably the point of diminishing returns. You want to get to the point where if someone raises their hand and says, hey, I wasn't informed, it's not you who has to say, oh, you just missed it. Someone else will say it for you. And that's when you know you've basically done the most that you possibly can. Also enroll your direct reports to canvass the organization when necessary. So it's not all on you as, let's say, the VP of engineering, because it can become exhausting, particularly over a long tenure. So get your leadership group involved and have them help out. So with that, the takeaways are, one, get outside advice. Plato's a great way to do that. Don't become subject to your own sort of echo chamber within a company. Always focus on end results and use some form of measurement. Make sure you're measuring the right thing. This can help counter bad instincts. But then also encourage skepticism. Listen to your people, listen to your own instincts to counter bad measurement. You need to do both of those things to make sure that you're on the right track. And also actions are louder than words. You may have picked up on it, but there's a number of times I said, like, the way to get better at this is to kind of not talk about it so much. Make sure you're doing some of the actions that I outlined. The talking itself won't achieve the ends that you're looking to achieve. And to the extent you don't, you sound less credible saying those same words over and over and over again. So with that, I figured we could jump into the Q&A. Happy to talk about anything in my background, my experience at GitLab, or certainly anything in the slide deck.
All right. Awesome. Thank you, Eric. We have a few questions already. Everyone go to the Q&A tabs, either add your questions or vote for the questions you'd like me to ask. We have a question about AI. Let's put it on the side for a minute because I'd like to stick to the topic just for a few minutes and then we can get back to it. So The question that's been the most voted after that, it's from Lindsay. Have you had to manage a perception of lack of transparency when it's actually a lack of clear roadmap? For example, team members upset about lack of insight into plans or direction when those things are not yet fully defined.
Yeah, this can definitely happen. Sometimes the team is sort of yearning for a piece of information that actually doesn't exist. So I think one aspect of transparency that's important is being vulnerable about what you don't know, and making that clear to people. And then the best thing you can do next is, start that project if it's clear the team wants that piece of information, and try to involve them in it. Try to be accepting of their proposals. How might they get started? And try to incorporate that in the output. Another of the sort of the three pillars from that Dan Pink book, Drive, is autonomy in terms of motivating knowledge workers. And so including engineers in what they're doing versus telling them what to build is really important. And so involving people in getting that answer is really important.
Another question about roadmap planning is how did you scale OKR and roadmap planning as the org grew? Because you mentioned 800 people, it's a lot of people to coordinate. So the next question is from Pavel.
Where is the question, just so I can read it?
It's on the bottom of the screen. How did you scale OKR and roadmap planning as the org grew?
So for OKRs, typically you might get started in a Google Doc or a Notion doc or something like that. As you scale, I think it becomes more and more important to use a tool. One of the main features that the various OKR tools out there provide is sort of inheritance in scoring. And so your OKRs will end up in this tree structure that kind of mimics your org chart. And if you're going by kind of, Andy Grove, former CEO of Intel, who wrote the book High Input Management, you're sort of, his idea of managerial leverage was that the product of a manager is the sum of the product of their team. So you typically want to reflect that in OKRs. And it allows you to, as a manager, focus on not some deliverable you're doing as an IC, but coordinating the sort of collective output of your group. And that means the score of your OKR is really the product of the score of n number of people kind of reporting to you. And that's the most leveraged thing that you could do. It's very difficult to do if you're capturing your OKRs in a spreadsheet or a Google Doc or something like that.
Awesome. The next question is from someone is asking questions about the time it takes to apply those changes. So implementing these changes can take a lot of time and resources. For example, transparency. How do I convince my leadership we should do these? And I guess a related question is, if it doesn't come from the top, if it doesn't come from the CEO, should you even bother and try to implement those big cultural shifts in your company, I guess?
Yeah, I think something like transparency is much easier when it comes down from the top. Usually those things are reflected in the core values of the company. If you're at a company, let's say I was at a company that had a lot of had a lot of aerospace industry experience, and transparency is not the norm in that industry, even with good and very smart people working there. So I think as a leader, you want to make the case that there's a benefit to this activity, try to show the ROI, try to show examples from other companies, examples maybe from your advisors. So it's not just your opinion, it's something that's corroborated by other successful organizations. Ultimately, if you're not successful convincing the company as a whole to do any of these things like transparency, then you still have your sphere of control, and that's your org. And what you can try to do is create a bubble, let's say, of transparency that your reports and their reports get to benefit from. You as a leader will at best get to have 1 foot in the rest of the company and then 1 foot in that environment. So you'll have to realize that like part of your responsibility is creating this arena for others. But you'll always have to operate in some way, shape, or form how the rest of the company operates.
Definitely, way harder to do it, but you can do it with increasing your sphere and influence in your company. the next most upvoted questions is some tangible examples of things you did to increase psychological safety.
Yeah, so psychological safety is a really interesting topic. I think it came into the vernacular. I believe Google did something called Project Aristotle. They had some IO psychologists study their own org. Google was with the skill to do that. They found psychological safety, which they defined as the willingness to take interpersonal risks, was something that their highest productivity teams had. And then when they looked at their best managers, those best managers could create that environment. I think there's a couple different scenarios. Sometimes you're at a relatively high performing team and you want to create that environment. I think you need to recognize you're in a totally different world if you're at a team or a company where psychological safety has been broken and you're restoring it from scratch. Very different sort of scenarios. I think rebuilding trust is kind of like a ladder. You need to probably make the first step as a leader and go to that first rung. And sometimes that means being vulnerable. I mentioned before, saying I don't know something is something that resonates with people. And then you need the people to reciprocate and kind of take the next step. So you're creating this psychologically safe space. People need to sort of step into it. And then they need to know that that's okay. They may be making a mistake. They're not penalized for that sort of thing. And then you need to do that again and again over time. And eventually people will learn that, hey, it's okay to throw out that idea and maybe it's right, maybe it's wrong. I'm not 100% confident, but I'm definitely not going to be shamed for throwing it out there. Something that I think is really important as a manager, getting to the sort of the tangible aspect of the question is, you may have to sort of solicit it from some team members. Some people I think sometimes people mistake psychological safety for, oh, well, it feels safe. It's like, no, it's still taking an interpersonal risk. It's never going to feel 100% safe. So you may have to draw it out of some team members and really kind of like call on them in a group meeting or something like that. You know that they've got an idea. You see that they're not speaking up. Try to pull it out of them in a gentle way, in front of the group. And I think if you do that repeatedly, other team members will see it, and those individuals will get more comfortable starting to raise their own hand or interject, in their own way.
Definitely, when I'm doing my stand-ups and I'm trying to call out people I have a big amount of trust with, people who've been here for a long time, so that then they can speak in front of everyone, show to others it's okay to disagree with the CEO or to disagree with whoever, and then other people will mimic this for sure, 100%. Okay, let's talk about AI. How do you think AI will change expectation we have among our engineering teams? Are we going to expect more from our engineering teams and from junior engineers? Are we going to need 800 engineers to run a company like GitLab? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, so when we say AI, I think like the moment we're in is about large language models in particular. There's many, many forms of AI up to including general AI, which doesn't really exist yet. So we're talking about large language models and coding tools like Copilot in particular. So just want to clarify that. I think, if you were building product X 10 years ago versus today, it's true to think that maybe you would need less engineers to do it, but like you're never competing against a company separated in time. You're always competing against your peers. So at the end of the day, number of engineers you have is a reflection of what market opportunity you have, what product you need to create to meet that market opportunity. And then that dictates your team size and composition. And AI is something that can make any given team, I think, more productive. Specific examples that it's good at right now is, if you're able to prompt it with your entire set of documentation, it can generate pretty good answers, pointers to the docs, and that can be kind of a learning benefit. It can also write really good boilerplate code. It can save you a few hours, initiating something from scratch. But I think it's relatively far away from being able to replace software engineers. I don't see AI generating large application architectures. I don't see it writing a ton of tests and a ton of error handling. I have got it to do those things by being really persistent about my prompts, like literally saying, write a ridiculous amount of unit tests, and then it will sort of write, what I would expect a human engineer to do. So I think it's hopefully a learning aid and an accelerant, but also it'll very quickly become table stakes where everybody has access to this. And, you have to use it, but it won't necessarily be a differentiator one engineering team to another.
So do you believe that we are going to have the next GitLab is going to be built with 10x less engineers?
No, I mean, it's, apologies for this analogy, but a famous example from history is Dr. Gatling inventing the Gatling gun. His goal was to reduce the amount of casualties in warfare by lessening the number of people that it was required to wage war. That's not what happened at all. What happened is that they produced a number of Gatling guns and they gave them to the same number of soldiers, right? So the way that technology disrupts and the way it exercises leverage is many times sort of counterintuitive. So I think there is still a shortage of software engineers compared to the ideas out there for companies and products and compared to the capital needed to fund them. So I think if anything, my hope is that it will make software engineering will stay like an interesting, fun career. Hopefully some of the toil is removed from it. I think those of us who kind of started our career in the current mode and are transitioning through probably have the toughest time adapting to this. I think younger software engineers will kind of come into work having learned in college with something like a Copilot. I think they'll have an easier time with that sort of adjustment. But I don't see AI coding assistants replacing software engineers anytime soon as some sort of like a low code, no code solution.
Yeah, my personal opinion on that is the slice of the cake are going to be smaller, but the whole cake is going to be way bigger. So we are going to have way more software engineers. For example, myself, I didn't code for 6 years, and I just got back to coding recently, and it was so fast to get back into it. And I think it was even faster than using some no-code things like Bubble or Coda or Notion or what else, or Airtable or what else. Just because LLM is actually by default text, so you can actually generate code way faster than even dragging, dropping, increasing the box, whatever.
I'd say one interesting thing that isn't being talked about a lot is how might these AI coding assistants influence programming languages themselves. So right now, programming languages are written for us to express, business logic and things. But if we're using AI to do the majority of the coding, maybe the languages need to be different. Maybe the AI should be writing in an abstract syntax tree or something like that. I don't know, but that'll be interesting to see over the next 10 years how languages change and how new languages appear. Maybe some are more amenable to high quality coding as the combined product of an AI assistant and human software engineer.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I think Zapier launched yesterday a plugin where you can actually define things in natural languages and they generate the code for you or whatever. But anyway, ChatGPT was also doing that, but it's interesting that companies are going into that direction. So another language is going to be invented, 100%. The next question is, thank you for sharing all your counterintuitive solutions to common problems. And the question is about, do you see other fields where counterintuitive practices can be put in place? For example, career management, efficiency, hiring?
Yeah, I think there's definitely counterintuitive solutions to all kinds of problems out there. I really thought deeply and came up with the 4 examples for my career, especially recently, that were interesting learnings for me. I'd have to sort of think offline if I have examples from a hiring perspective or some of these other topics.
Any example for hiring or efficiency, or just one or two top of mind?
Let's see. Well, I mean, I guess, efficiency measurement might have some of those same failure modes as predictability. You could argue predictability is a form of efficiency. So I think my takeaway of making sure you're measuring end results applies to efficiency measurement as well. You may focus on efficiency and accidentally lower overall productivity or lower quality or some of these other factors. One general tip that might be helpful is try to always have 2 metrics at least that kind of counteract or buttress one another. So not an engineering example, but at GitLab, I ran support engineering as well. And so SLAs are a common metric for support organizations. especially first reply time. One way you can improve first reply time accidentally is by giving people low quality but rapid answers. So the way you counteract that is by also measuring customer satisfaction. So if you're in a world where your SLA FRT measurement is going up, but customer satisfaction is going down, it tells you that you've done the wrong thing. So you always want to make sure as you're making process changes, as you're making interventions, that you want those two metrics to, at a minimum, you want them to go up at the same time, or at a minimum, you want to not have an inverse relationship between those two. You want one to stay steady while you're raising the other one. And then you know you've sort of truly done the right thing because you're focused on that end result of a happy customer.
Good one. Thank you for sharing. The next question is from Nick. Have you ever had to restore morale after a large layoff within a company? If so, what is something that a leader can do to help restore confidence in the company?
Yeah. I have gone through this periodically in my career. At my fourth company, I'd say, smaller ones at my third company. I think the things, there's really no substitute for engineers seeing how their work is being used, seeing the company be successful. So I would focus on customers and customer wins. That's maybe like the most important thing that you could do. And again, getting back to Dan Pink's book Drive and Purpose, making sure that you as a manager are sort of telling those stories, those narratives about, hey, these customers are being successful, and this is how the engineering work is impacting that success. That will give people purpose and ultimately inspire company confidence, I think.
Yes, we have been through layoff, unfortunately, at Plato too. One of the things that I still has been working the best is just moving forward and shipping and building and just getting back to work as soon and as fast as possible and celebrating every single win at, things that you would not have maybe celebrated before. Just celebrate them. Celebrate 10x more the small things in the next few weeks that follow. And I think that people are going to understand at some point that there are also going to be some advantages of being smaller, more nimble, faster, etc. So this is what happened and worked really well for us. All right. We have two follow-up questions about OKR, so let's tackle them. The first one is any recommended tools for managing OKR in a hierarchy like you recommended? And the second one, let's do the second one right after.
Yeah, there's a bunch of them out there. 7 Geese is one I used at a prior company. I know that John Doerr, who runs Kleiner Perkins, he was actually at Intel, I think, reporting to Andy Grove, whose book I mentioned earlier. Intel famously did a pivot from, a lot of people don't remember this, but they were a memory company and pivoted to CPUs. They used OKRs to perform that pivot. It's one of the most famous pivots in history, it's successful ones. So John Doerr is a fan of OKRs. He visits a lot of his portfolio companies, teaches them OKRs, and I think he's got a couple OKR companies in his portfolio that he's invested in or helped found. And so those ones tend to be quite good. There's a lot of them out there. I think one of the things you want to be mindful of when you're selecting a tool is it's typically the type of tool that needs to exist company-wide. So something that's not just got to work for engineering, but also sales and marketing and G&A, so your HR, finance functions. And they have different needs, different types of goals, and you just want to make sure you choose something that's flexible enough that works for the entire company. And I would say, like, beyond tools, like the thing, OKRs are sometimes misused as a performance management tool, as a project management tool. To me, the values you're looking to get out of OKRs are keeping the organization aligned and providing focus. So things are in OKRs in part so those leaders that own those OKRs can say no to 10 other things throughout that quarter that are coming up, because those are the most important things. It doesn't mean that there wouldn't be a correlation between someone that's low performing and someone not regularly achieving their OKRs, but that's not the primary focus of OKRs.
So your point is to make sure that we are separating the OKR with project management and performance. Those are different things. Should be maybe in different tools or different processes. It's a good one. Another question about OKR is you mentioned that the manager OKR being the sum of the team's output outcome. So how do you separate out strength and shortcomings of the team versus those of the manager?
Yeah, I think, over long time spans, those things become one and the same. There's definitely situations, let's say in the short term, maybe a manager inherits a new team that's high performing. You should look at that concept of managerial leverage with skepticism in that regard. But, over a long time span, that leader is responsible for hiring to the team, for managing performance, for promoting the right people. And then if you're getting good results, that's a job well done. And I think they're very well aligned and arguably indistinguishable.
I think we have time for 2 more questions. I like the one from Stefan. So from your experience, is variable salary in engineering leadership in particular a solution to increase accountability? Or do you have any other solution, maybe a counterintuitive solution? What do you think?
Yeah, I think so. Variable comp, meaning a bonus that's aligned with the company achieving their the plan. I think that is a really important thing. Typically comes online for companies, let's say Series B or C phase, maybe not so much in the beginning, where you're kind of just focused on product market fit. I think certainly for executives, there's really no difference in this regard between an engineering executive, a sales executive. Let's say it's normal in sales to have much more variable comp, but at the end of the day, you need executives and leaders. You need their incentives aligned with the company's incentives. I think when you're talking about manager, director levels, those bonus amounts are typically a smaller % of the overall comp. Because the person does have a smaller scope. And sometimes when you're deeply embedded in an organization, it can be more difficult to see how, your area ties to the overall, let's say, like revenue achievement of a company, but still important. You want to make sure that you have kind of a one team feel and that people feel like there really aren't scenarios where I can succeed and the company fails. That's just not sort of an appropriate way to align incentives or to feel especially at a small company or a growing company.
Good one. My last question, I think let's have one more questions, and this one is really related to your career. So can you talk a bit more about your involvement in the Linux Foundation and what does the foundation do and what's your role? How do you get involved? Let's finish the Q&A with that one.
Sure. Yeah. So I was a board member of the Linux Foundation for 2 years. In my case, I had to go through an election process. So I believe if you're I forget if it's a gold or a platinum member in the Linux Foundation, companies buy those memberships, and at that level, they're guaranteed a board seat. GitLab was a silver member, and there's probably on the order of 100 or 200 silver company members. And the silver companies all share one board seat. So I had to go for an election process and was fortunate enough to win that election process. So my role was to really represent GitLab, my company, but also represent all the silver members on the Linux Foundation board. What the Linux Foundation does is basically, it's an umbrella for, at this point, 200 or 300 open source projects. And tries to make them all as successful as possible. They believe in the power of open source software to provide a ton of value, positively impact society. So they give open source project leaders and founders a variety of tools to do so. And then, of course, the power of the network. So, for instance, there are some very prominent open source contributors that based on a language or based on their domain interests would contribute code and time to a variety of LF projects versus just one. So those are the types of things that the LF can do. They also provide a lot of training to companies, how to be a Linux admin, how to do any number of things. So my goal was to try to create win-wins. Like, what are things that GitLab could do that's good for GitLab, that's also good for the Linux Foundation, and see if I could drive that within the company. And then as far as working with the LF, did board meetings, and the job of a good board member, I think, is to have the greatest impact while providing the least amount of interference, and let Jim, the chair, and his team actually run the LF. So it's really about like asking really good penetrating questions, helping them see around corners, things they might not be able to anticipate, but then knowing when to hold back and say, okay, I'm not operating here like I am at my company. I'm going to leave it to them to fix these challenges and fully characterize those problems, and just be available for the occasional question or network intro or something like that. So board work is interesting. It's not quite what you think it is. It's certainly not being an executive at a company, although typically those opportunities come when you've already functioned at the executive level of a company.
Yeah, I've seen you growing a lot, taking those side responsibilities. We're hearing that a lot from mentors in Plato. They're growing as much as their mentees. So I would encourage everyone to identify those opportunities that can help you grow a lot. All right, I think it's a wrap for today. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Eric, thank you very much for your time and being one of our fantastic mentors.